Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. The learning this morning is sponsored by Miriam and Jeff Zuckerman to commemorate the yortzites of Miriam's sister, Leah Bas Yosef HaKohen, and her mother, Chai Gittel Bas Meir. Should be schus for the neshamos. Okay, beginning with Sefer Vayikra, we'll just see the Ramban's introduction at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra. This is even before Pasuk Aleph. The Ramban says, HaSefer Hazeh Hu Toras Kohanim uLevim. This book of Chumash is all about the laws relating to Kohanes and Levites. Yevorbo in Yonei HaKarbanos Kulam, Umishmeres HaMishkan. It discusses aspects regarding sacrifices and appropriate guardianship of the Mishkan. Kikasher HaYasefer Echad Binyan HaGalus VaGeula Mimenu, because the previous book of Chumash had to do with the exile of Egypt and redemption from Egypt. V'Shlimo Binyan Oel Moed Uchvod Hashem Hashem Mileas HaMishkan. The end of the book of Shmos is the fact that there's this tent of meeting and the honor of God, glory of God fills the Mishkan. And if you remember, the Ramban explained that really the logical closure of the exodus from Egypt is Har Sinai. It's certainly relevant to think about as we come closer to Pesach. And of course, it's fascinating already at the second Seder, we're beginning to count Sfira, which shows the bridge between the exodus from Egypt and the giving of the Torah of Shavuos. But then the Ramban explained in Sefer Shmos that the whole experience of the Mishkan is intended to sort of recreate that bond that was so much clarified at the giving of the Torah. So therefore, the Mishkan is the logical follow-up to the giving of the Torah. So now that we've ended the book of Shmos on the topic of the Mishkan, Sivo b'karbanos b'shmiras haMishkan. Now God gives instructions regarding sacrifices and appropriate guardianship of the Mishkan. Shira karbanos kapara lahem, that the sacrifices can be an atonement for the Jewish people, because the whole purpose of this Mishkan is to have a place where the divine presence can reside. And if the Jewish people sin too much, that will cause God to pull out his divine presence from the Mishkan because he won't want to connect with us anymore. So therefore, there are two possibilities. One is we just shouldn't sin, which is pretty hard for us. And the other is that we should have a means of atoning when we do sin. And so therefore, it's more than just technical rules of the Mishkan. This is what the Mishkan is fundamentally all about, retaining this prominent bond between God and the Jewish people. Once we're talking about the Mishkan and Karbanos, so there are laws regarding ritual purity if a Kohen is going to come into the Mishkan. They shouldn't come too close to the sacred areas. It's very interesting. So the same way that even the Kohen Gadol is limited, the Kohen Gadol can't just walk into the Kodesh HaKadoshim whenever he feels like it. There are rules. But says the Ramban, this parallels that at Har Sinai, the Jewish people couldn't just come up the mountain. So it's another fascinating parallel between the Mishkan and Har Sinai. Okay. Skipping a line or two, Vini Roba, Sefer Hazeh, B'Karbanos. Most of this book deals with sacrifices, B'Toras HaKorban, V'Hamakrivim, U'Makom Shiskaribo, whether it be the laws of the sacrifice itself, whether it be laws regarding the people involved with the sacrifices, whether it be the place that the sacrifice is brought. There are some mitzvos associated with these things that are also brought down here. We begin by talking about voluntary offerings. And in the context of those offerings, we prohibit fat and blood. Then we move on to sacrifices brought for sins. So then, after we've discussed the sacrifices for different sins, we talk about prohibited foods because they render a person ritually impure. So if a person eats of these foods or touches them, they're not allowed to touch sacred things. They're not allowed to come into a sacred area. And if a person were to come into the Mishkan in this state of impurity, they'd have to bring an offering. So we've touched on a lot of topics, and now the Ramban says it's important to talk about the laws of the person who gets tzaras, this ritual type of leprosy. and laws involving a woman who gives birth. There's certain types of offerings she brings. First of all, these people all bring korbanos, so it's relevant to this book, but also there are unique laws of ritual impurity for these people, so they need to know the rules, because they need to know when they can come into the Mishkan, when they can't come into the Mishkan. Okay, skipping a line or so. Then later on in the book of Vayikra, it gets into illicit sexual relations. So he says, because that is considered to be fundamentally impure, and that certainly causes the divine presence to leave. And again, I want to remind you, the Ramban didn't just say, oh, yeah, we just have this Mishkan, so now once we have a Mishkan, you need a how-to book. The Ramban said it much more meaningfully than that. The Ramban said the Mishkan is all about retaining this bond between God and the Jewish people. And so we need to talk about how to serve him appropriately in the Mishkan. And we need to talk about what not to do so as not to lose that bond. By the way, there's another relevance to illicit sexual relations here, because if a person has illicit sexual relations and maybe didn't realize it was a halachic problem, has to bring an offering. Then it talks about Shabbos and Yom Tovim. Why does it talk about Shabbos and Yom Tovim? Because there are special offerings brought on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So that also fits into this book. Most of the sections of this book focus on the Kohen. Daber al Aaron v'elpanav, Savas Aaron v'espanav, Parshas Kedoshim, Ktsas Mitzvos l'bnei Yisrael. So most of the sections of this book are addressed to Aaron and his sons. Now it happens to be in Parshas Kedoshim there are some mitzvahs for the general Jewish people. Ruben Nigroris Minyane HaKarbanos Obedom Lahem. Most of them are connected in some way to Karbanos. It's a very interesting Ramban. It almost might be worthwhile to sort of almost keep a little tab on this Ramban throughout Sefer Vayikra, because when you go through Sefer Vayikra, it's sometimes very confusing. What's this even doing in this book? And so it's an interesting Ramban that kind of drew us a line of connection. Okay, let's go now to chapter 1, verse 9. Chapter 1, verse 9, we're talking about the Ola offering here. This was a voluntary offering that was completely burned before God. And we say in verse 9, and he should wash in water the innards of the animal. The Kohen should burn all of it on the altar. Olah, this is an Ola offering. Ishe reach nichoach laHashem. This is an offering of a pleasant scent before God. And one could very well pose the question, what in the world about taking this animal, slaughtering it, and then burning it makes a pleasant scent before God? What about this is better than that? And, and why? And one could ask, of course, the broader question, why would God want us to bring offerings anyway? Why is this of interest to God? This is a very famous Ramban over here. Go to the Ramban on Pasuk Tes. We're going to start in the middle of the Ramban. In mine, it's the third paragraph of the Ramban on Pasuk Tes, beginning with the word V'hinei. If you don't have it broken down the same way, it's probably around 10 lines into the Ramban. V'hinei, because of Azeh Tamar Karbanos, Shem Ishei Reach Nichoach LaHashem. This pasuk, in a nutshell, seems to be telling us why Karbanos are brought, that they're intended to be a fine-smelling scent before God. V'yama harav b'mor nevuchim, kitama Karbanos, bavur shamitzrim v'akastim, asher ho Yisrael gerim v'toshavim ba'artzim ha'olam. Hayu ovdim l'bakar l'tzon. So the Ramban cites the Rambam, who says, look, the Jewish people have lived among the Egyptians, among the Chaldeans, and these nations would worship animals. The Egyptians worshiped sheep. The Chaldeans worshipped demons that they felt looked like goats. the people, the Rambam speaks about the people of Hodu, Turkey, that on principle don't slaughter animals because of their reverence for these animals, don't slaughter cattle because of their reverence. So the Rambam says the Jewish people find themselves surrounded by people who worship animals. Therefore, specifically these three types of animals, God gives a mitzvah: take these animals and slaughter them in service of God, so that it should be known. So the idea is that we look at this faith of other groups, of other nations, and we say the very deities that they worship, we slaughter those deities in service to God. And through our devotion to God in this way, this will be an atonement for us. Okay, so this is the Rambam's idea. The Rambam's idea is that the idea behind these sacrifices is we see worship of animals in other nations, and we take these animals and we slaughter them to God. But the Ramban says, Vinehem Devrei Havoy. He doesn't think this is true. Yirafu Shever Gadol Kush Yerabba Al Nakala Yasu Shulchan Hashem Megohal Sheinenu Rak Lahotzi Liban Shal Shoyim B'Tiv Sheolam Va'Kasav Amerkim Lechem Ishe Reach L'Choach L'Hashem. Ramban is very, very bothered by this. He says, look, you're saying that the whole idea of korbanos that are described in our pasuk as being this tremendous favor before God is because there are some foolish people who do something, and we're going to show that we're not foolish like them. This is what korbanos are all about, that if there wouldn't have been this foolish people who ever did this, then there'd be no purpose to do this. The Ramban has a very difficult time with that. We're going to get more into this tomorrow, God